Owen Hudson never considered himself a confrontational man, but he had always believed in boundaries, both physical and personal. After 28 years working in water systems maintenance, Owen knew how important it was to respect what lay beneath the surface, both literally and metaphorically. When he finally retired, he used every bit of his savings to buy a modest but well-built house tucked against a narrow strip of woodland, where the land sloped gently down into a basin. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. The house sat above a private septic field he had inspected thoroughly before purchasing. He had chosen it precisely because of the autonomy it provided. No need to rely on city lines, no nosy neighbors sharing pipes, no unannounced meter readings. Just his land, his systems, his responsibility. It didn't take long for Owen to fall into rhythm with the quiet. He got up at dawn most mornings and tended to small repairs around the property. His days were filled with minor carpentry work, cleaning his tools, checking the filtration pump, or reading beside the wood stove. He rarely ventured into town unless he needed supplies. A man content with his own company, Owen found solace in knowing that everything on his land was where it was supposed to be. Until Karen Lassiter moved in. Karen arrived with the kind of energy that immediately clashed with Owen's quiet equilibrium. She was loud without meaning to be, smiling in a way that never quite touched her eyes. Her SUV was always parked slightly crooked, her garbage bins perpetually left half open, and she had a habit of calling across driveways rather than walking the short distance to have a conversation. From the moment she moved into the adjacent lot, a slightly smaller, flatter property downhill from Owen's, she made her presence known. Within the first week, she had introduced herself 3 times, each time with a different variation of the same homemade jam and a flurry of commentary about the potential of our little corner of paradise. At first, Owen thought little of it. He had dealt with difficult personalities before. On job sites, in apartment complexes, during drought season when people panicked about their wells. Karen seemed at worst overbearing and overly social. But the warning signs were there, subtle but cumulative. She asked casual questions about his septic system, what kind of setup he had, whether he thought it was still efficient for today's standards. She joked that his backlot looked like an abandoned horse pasture, and mentioned how charming a guest cabin would look with the forest as a backdrop. When he told her politely but firmly that the back of his property was off limits and structurally sensitive, she laughed it off. "Oh, come on, I'm not going to put up a hotel," she said with a wink. "Just thinking out loud." But her tone changed after the local neighborhood committee elected Karen to a temporary oversight position. It was a vague role. Officially, she was in charge of community development initiatives, though no one, including Karen, could explain what that actually entailed. All Owen knew was that after she took that role, she started spending a lot more time walking her property line with measuring tape and clipboard in hand. One day, he caught her standing on his side of the property marker, eyeing the slope near his septic tank. When he stepped outside and asked if she needed something, she merely smiled and said, "Just admiring the view." "You've got the best elevation on this hill, you know that." Owen didn't like to be rude, but something in her posture unsettled him. She had the stance of someone assessing, not admiring. That evening he went into the shed, pulled out his surveyor's map, and reread the technical specifications of his land. His septic system occupied a large portion of the rear third of the lot, an underground field he'd personally overseen during the inspection phase before the purchase. It wasn't just a tank, it was a complete self-contained system with a pressure distribution network, vent risers, and a backup overflow line that connected to a relief trench 30 feet from the edge of his garage. The soil in that area was shallow but rich, perfect for drainage but dangerous for foundations. No one had any business building within 50 feet of it. Any disruption to that system could compromise not just his property's function, but its livability. Then came the excavation. One morning, Owen woke up to the sound of grinding gears and backing alarms. Outside his bedroom window, a flatbed truck was unloading a prefabricated wooden frame and several concrete footings. A team of laborers, none of whom Owen recognized, were working at a rapid pace, digging post holes and placing formwork directly over the northwest section of his back lot, squarely over the septic field. He threw on his boots and coat and marched out toward the property line, waving down the apparent foreman, a young man with a clipboard and reflective vest. "I think you've got the wrong lot," Owen said, keeping his voice calm but firm. The man looked up from his paperwork and pointed toward Karen's property. "We're building, per the request of Miss Lassiter. Guest cabin," she said. "Shouldn't take more than a couple days." "You're standing 10 feet into my property," Owen replied, tightening his jaw. "That's my field you're building on. There's a septic system under there." The foreman hesitated and looked toward Karen, who had just appeared at the edge of her porch in workout gear, coffee mug in hand. "I don't think so," he muttered, then called out, "Hey, Miss Lassiter, is this guy right?" Karen sauntered over with all the false cheer of a politician visiting a nursing home. "Oh, Owen, don't be so dramatic. I had the lines checked. There's a small buffer zone, but it's not a real septic. It's just drain field, right? And it's barely even active." Owen couldn't believe what he was hearing. "It's a pressurized system, and yes, it's active. This isn't some graywater spill zone. It's a designed, licensed, maintained network, and you've got your footing sitting on top of its riser line." Karen waved her hand dismissively, as if he had told her to turn down the music. "Well, we'll just keep everything light and modular. No foundation, no problem. Besides, it's temporary. Seasonal use only. It's practically a gazebo." But it wasn't. Owen could see the blueprints in the worker's hand. Insulated walls, electric hookups, plumbing access. This was no gazebo. This was a habitable structure, built illegally on infrastructure she didn't own or understand. He walked away, chest tight, hands balled into fists inside his coat pockets. He needed to think. Not react. Not scream. Think. By that evening, construction was well underway. No one had stopped. He called the county land office, left messages. He emailed the Environmental Health Department. He documented everything. And in the silence of his house, the only thing he could hear was the low, persistent hum of something shifting beneath the surface. His land, his patience, his peace. And somewhere under that soft, wet soil, his system was already under pressure. For the next 3 days, Owen watched the guest cabin rise like an infection in his backyard. He didn't need to go outside to see the progress. The hammering, sawing, and careless yelling carried straight through his walls. The frame became walls, the walls became a roof, and before long vinyl siding appeared in the same off-white color as Karen's main house. It was no longer just a seasonal structure. It was a fully enclosed building with windows, air vents, and electrical conduit visible along the back wall. Despite his protests and documentation, no inspector came, no stop orders arrived, and no one seemed interested in the boundary violations he had so meticulously reported. Owen wasn't surprised, but the complete lack of response from the county left him feeling as if the ground was shifting under him. Not just physically, but symbolically. Something foundational, once dependable, now felt brittle and unprotected. By day 5, he stopped trying to get someone to listen on the phone and instead drove directly to the County Environmental Services office. The woman at the front desk, polite in a robotic way, told him the file had been received and was under initial review. When he pressed for a timeline or escalation, she merely repeated that any unauthorized construction over a septic system was considered a violation under certain conditions, and that someone may follow up in the coming weeks. He wanted to laugh. Weeks? By then the structure would be wired, plumbed, furnished, and producing its own waste. He explained again that the building sat directly on top of his active drain field and could cause serious backflow or system failure. She nodded vaguely and scribbled something on a yellow pad. "We'll add this to the complaint file," she said. then handed him a generic trifold brochure titled Understanding Residential Septic Management. On the drive back home, Owen stopped at the hardware store and picked up a second inspection port. Cover, heavy-duty, reinforced. If no one was going to protect his system for him, he'd at least make it harder for someone else to tamper with it. He returned to find Karen standing in her side yard, admiring the construction with a neighbor he didn't recognize. They were sipping from tall glasses, laughing in a way that grated on him. She caught his eye and gave a small wave, more of a show for the neighbor than any attempt at civility. The final straw came a week later when Owen noticed a new line running from the back of the Karen's cabin across the property slope. It wasn't buried. It was a simple rubber wastewater hose, the kind used for RV graywater disposal, and it was connected, clumsily, insultingly, to one of the capped cleanouts in his septic field. Someone had removed the cap, inserted a Y-splitter with a makeshift seal, and routed her waste output directly into his system as if it were an open sewer line. No permit, no check-in, no consultation, just assumption and entitlement. He stared at the connection for nearly a full minute before he even felt the anger. It wasn't even sophisticated. It was lazy, and that made it worse. She hadn't just invaded his property, she had treated it like nothing worth respecting. Owen didn't scream. He didn't storm over to Karen's door or rip the pipe out of the ground. Instead, he went inside, poured himself black coffee, and stood by the window for a long time. He thought about his father's advice when they used to dig wells in the summers. Water always follows the path of least resistance. People too. Until you make it cost them something. Karen had taken the easiest path, physically, legally, and socially, because she knew how long the enforcement process dragged, and how little anyone cared unless things exploded. So Owen decided to make it costly. Not loudly, not illegally, but effectively. That night, under cover of darkness and mist, he opened the secondary valve access on his septic system and installed a back pressure valve. One he had designed himself years ago, mainly out of curiosity. It wasn't meant to damage anything, but it had a particular feature. If an external source attempted to push liquid in without proper flow coordination, the valve would slowly close and reroute excess pressure back through the nearest open line, in this case, the guest cabin's graywater hose. He wasn't sabotaging. He was securing. He filmed the entire process, time-stamped and narrated, just in case someone ever accused him of malicious intent. It was his infrastructure, his land, his right. 2 days later, Karen sent him a text. He hadn't given her his number, which meant she had pulled it from a local directory listing. The message was short. "Hi, neighbor. Just wondering if everything's working okay with your septic? Noticed a small smell this morning. Hope it's not an issue." Owen didn't respond. She knew exactly what she'd done and was fishing for whether he'd discovered it or was preparing a response. He deleted the message and took photos of the valve setup, marking down the time and flow data from his monitoring panel. The readings were fine. His system was absorbing the graywater surge, but just barely. It was operating well beyond normal tolerances. The longer this continued, the greater the risk that his leach field would become saturated or blow back entirely. Then the smell would no longer be hypothetical. That afternoon, he made one more call, this time not to the county but to a private environmental inspector he had met years ago during a systems training session. The man was semi-retired but owed Owen a favor and agreed to come out off the books the following week. He wouldn't be able to file anything officially, but he could verify and document the illegality of the connection in detail. That was all Owen needed. A clean record, a third-party verification, and a complete file to hand over to legal if this ever reached court. Quietly, without complaint, he was setting the trap. Karen's behavior shifted as well. Sensing she might have crossed a line, she turned up the charm in short, curated bursts. She left a small tin of muffins by his gate one morning with a sticky note that read, "Thanks for being such a patient neighbor." "I owe you a drink sometime soon." He threw them in the compost. Later that day, he overheard her on a speakerphone call on her deck, loudly describing the guest cabin as an eco-friendly retreat space she'd soon be listing on a short-term basis to vetted guests. The phrase made his jaw tighten. It wasn't just a guest cabin anymore, it was a rental. She had built a business on top of his system without so much as asking, and now she planned to invite strangers to stay there and flush water into his field. He started logging everything: times of visible use, lights on in the cabin at night, guests arriving. He wasn't being paranoid. He was documenting a pattern. The final blow came when he discovered she had added a makeshift shower stall behind the cabin, complete with a garden hose feeder and a drain plate hammered straight into the soil. It was crude, unregulated, and directed runoff even closer to his already stressed septic zone. The inspector came the following morning and confirmed what Owen already knew. Her setup was reckless, unsanitary, and liable to fail. "You know, if this backs up," the inspector said, crouched beside the field while tapping a moisture probe into the soil, "they're not going to blame her. She'll say it was your system failing under old age. And most people believe the new build is clean and the old one is the problem. Especially when it's underground and nobody understands how it works." Owen nodded. "That's why I need proof. I need to be ahead of it." "You are," the man replied. "But you'd better do something soon. You're at capacity already, and she just put in an outdoor faucet hookup. That'll tip it." Owen waited until the party. He hadn't known there would be one, not officially. But a large rental SUV pulled up the next evening, and by sunset, a handful of professionally dressed guests were seated in and around the cabin with wine glasses and folding chairs, music floating up toward his windows. Laughter spilled over the slope like runoff. Light blazed from every window. The guest cabin was live. And so was his valve. He didn't touch a thing. He didn't need to. The system, overloaded and betrayed, would speak for itself. The morning after the party, Owen woke to a low, stinging pressure behind his eyes, the kind that came not from lack of sleep but from a body braced for confrontation. He hadn't touched the cabin, hadn't interfered with the plumbing, hadn't even stepped onto her property, but the septic field had done exactly what systems do when overwhelmed. It responded, uninvited. Around 2 a.m., while the music was still playing faintly in the distance, Owen had heard a subtle shift in the tone of the ground, a subterranean gurgle, the kind of cough that systems make when they're being forced past their design. By 2:15, the pressure valve had done its job. At 2:30, the rerouted line pushed upward with enough force to send gray water gushing into the base of the Karen's cabin, starting with the floor-level vents she had foolishly installed without a platform barrier. What should have been a small cosmetic weekend structure now carried the stench of rot, mildew, and unprocessed wastewater, soaking into the unfinished subfloor and leaching into the surrounding slope. Owen didn't gloat. He didn't even feel vindicated. The moment he stepped outside, he knew the mess had become more than physical. The rental SUV was gone, but the plastic chairs had been scattered across the slope, some overturned, others still ringed with the muddy imprint of the last night's guests. The door to the cabin hung slightly ajar, and from it wafted a scent Owen knew too well from his professional years: untreated waste meeting untreated wood in warm conditions. It wasn't just disgusting, it was structural contamination, the kind of damage that spreads quietly until the frame itself softens and swells, impossible to fix without full deconstruction. Karen's shiny guest cabin, barely 2 weeks old, was now a liability in every legal sense of the word. By noon, she was outside, pacing. Gone was the breezy neighbor with muffins and wine. Karen was in a state of tight-lipped fury, her voice sharp even when she wasn't yelling. She called someone, possibly a contractor or maybe the property management company, and her tone was no longer performative. It was clipped, angry, and increasingly desperate. Owen heard fragments from across the property line, words like backflow, soaked insulation, uninhabitable, and finally the one that made his stomach sink. Retaliation. That word was going to stick. It didn't matter that she had been the one who hooked into his system without permission. If this went to lawyers or worse, to the public, she would frame it not as negligence, but as sabotage. Sure enough, 2 days later, a county officer arrived. Not a health inspector, but a deputy with a clipboard and a casual air that tried to mask the discomfort of being pulled into a civil neighbor dispute. Owen met him at the gate. The man introduced himself as Deputy Lindell, and though he tried to open with pleasantries, the purpose of his visit was clear. Karen had filed an informal report, claiming Owen had intentionally tampered with her property's access to shared utilities, resulting in damages to her new structure. She claimed it was part of an ongoing pattern of hostility. Owen didn't flinch. He calmly handed Lindell a copy of his parcel map, a printout of the septic layout certified at the time of purchase, a dated photo of the Y-connector Karen's laborers had installed into his cleanout, and the notarized letter he'd sent to her the day. After that connection had been discovered, Lindell studied the documents with a furrowed brow, clearly not expecting the level of preparation. When Owen showed him the footage of his own field maintenance, including the valve installation performed entirely on his side of the property line, the deputy let out a soft exhale that sounded suspiciously like relief. "Mr. Hudson," he said finally, "this looks pretty comprehensive. I don't think we're dealing with a criminal matter here. Might be something civil if she wants to pursue it. But from where I stand, you took every precaution." Owen nodded once. "I'm not asking for permission to defend my land," he said quietly. "Just recognition that I did it by the book." Lindell hesitated, then added, "She's pretty insistent. If she pushes this into mediation or civil court, just be ready. People like her—" He paused, choosing his words. "They escalate." "I am ready," Owen replied. "Have been since the first footing went in." As predicted, the situation didn't diffuse. It metastasized. Karen posted a printed notice on the side of her own garage claiming she had been harassed and sabotaged by an unnamed neighbor and that her property had been compromised by unlawful interference. While she didn't name Owen directly, the EO implication was loud enough. Within a week, 3 other neighbors had started giving him wide berth, and one had even paused during a morning jog to ask, hesitantly, "Is everything okay between you and Karen? She seems upset." Owen didn't engage. He knew public perception would settle wherever noise was loudest, and Karen was nothing if not persistent in the art of curated victimhood. He focused instead on the system. The moisture levels in the leach field were finally returning to normal. His backup trench had absorbed the worst of the overflow, but he still replaced 2 riser caps and cleaned the filters twice as a precaution. What worried him more than the water was the sense that Karen had something else planned. The quiet was unnatural. She wasn't a woman who accepted losses. She turned them into narratives. It came in the form of a registered letter, not from Karen herself, but from a local law firm, Foreman and Trent, representing Ms. Karen Lassiter in matters relating to property encroachment and willful damages. The letter alleged that Owen's system had been modified in such a way as to create a deliberate backflow event, resulting in significant property damage, health, risk, and loss of income from future bookings. It demanded immediate cessation of interference, monetary damages for the estimated repair costs, and legal fees. It also claimed that Karen's property had historical easement access to shared infrastructure. Owen read it twice, then a third time. The claim was absurd. There was no easement. He had reviewed the land records before buying the property and had even confirmed with the previous owner that the lot's systems were entirely autonomous. But legal threats don't rely on truth. They rely on pressure. And this was pressure. designed not just to intimidate, but to force settlement before clarity. He scanned the document, printed out a copy, and locked it in his filing cabinet. Then he called a lawyer. He had avoided it until now. Owen believed in doing things himself, but he also believed in smart escalation. His attorney, a woman named Dana Hillman, came highly recommended. She reviewed the documents in silence, her eyes narrowing only once at the phrase, historical easement. When she was done, she closed the folder and gave a soft grunt of contempt. "She doesn't have a case," Dana said flatly. "But that won't stop her from trying to make it one. She's hoping you'll offer a settlement just to avoid dragging this out." "I won't," Owen said simply. "Good," she nodded, "because I won't either. We'll respond with documentation, highlight her unauthorized tie-in, and file a counterclaim for unauthorized use of your system and damages related to septic overburden. And Owen," he looked up, "don't talk to her. Don't reply to anything that doesn't come through legal. And if she tries to provoke you, document, don't respond." He nodded. He understood. This was no longer a property dispute. It was a war of position, fought with paper and pressure and performance, and Karen Lassiter was not done performing. She escalated again 2 weeks later, submitting a complaint to the Neighborhood Oversight Committee, not a legal entity but a powerful social force in this semi-rural community. Her complaint cited Owen's system as a known environmental hazard, claiming it was unsuitable for modern occupancy and had caused a toxic spill event. Without any verification, the committee issued a letter recommending that Owen's property undergo environmental reinspection. It wasn't enforceable, but it was loud, and neighbors saw the envelope. One even asked him if the county was condemning the place. He smiled tightly and said no, but inside something twisted. Karen had no limits, and that made her dangerous. But Owen had one advantage she didn't: time. Systems revealed truth through repetition, and Karen's pattern was becoming undeniable. He just needed to hold the line long enough for it to bury her, not with revenge, but with evidence. The next time she stepped out to water her roses, pretending not to glance in his direction, he didn't look away. He met her eyes, silent, steady, unmoved. And for the first time since she arrived, she looked away first. Owen had always believed that time, when handled properly, could sharpen a man's resolve more efficiently than rage ever could. As the pressure from Karen's escalating campaign against him mounted, from legal threats to public whispers to strategically timed accidental deliveries left at the edge of his property, he maintained a calm that to outsiders might have looked like passivity, but was in fact the quiet compression of patience into something far denser and far more dangerous. He spent his days preparing, collecting, recording, and repairing, not with the anxious desperation of someone being chased, but with the deliberate cadence of a man building a case from the ground up. Each morning he would check the moisture levels in the leach field, inspect the integrity of the pressure valve, and download timestamps from his system monitor, all of it tucked away into a growing digital archive. Not just data, but a quiet argument being built underground, the same way roots silently split concrete. It was on a gray morning in early April that the pivot came. The rain had started at 4 a.m., and by 8:30 the rear portion of his property, where the slope dipped toward the tree line, was saturated. This wasn't unusual for the season, but what Owen hadn't expected was the appearance of a white municipal van parked beside Karen's driveway, with its hazard lights blinking, and a man in a reflective vest unloading a set of tools from the rear. Owen watched from the porch as the worker walked directly to the border of their properties, stepped over the makeshift flagging line she had staked a month ago, and began opening a soil auger. The side of the van read Surface Compliance Division, and the patch on the man's shoulder was county-issued. This wasn't a delivery or a contractor, this was a real inspection. He walked calmly to the fence line, careful not to step into her yard, and waited until the man looked up. "You with the county?" he asked, voice level. The inspector nodded, polite but professional. "Routine soil absorption test," he said, glancing at a clipboard. "Complaint filed about possible saturation runoff from an aging wastewater system. Need to verify drainage capacity, see if there's evidence of spillage toward neighboring structures." Owen said nothing, only gave a slight nod and returned to his porch. It didn't matter that he knew his system was working fine. What mattered was that Karen had managed to get an official agency to take interest, and that meant someone had triggered a higher threshold, either through repetition or manipulation. She was moving from implication to formal documentation, hoping to generate enough smoke that someone, somewhere, would declare a fire. But what she hadn't anticipated, what she couldn't manipulate, was the result. The inspector worked in the rain for over 3 hours, taking samples from multiple depths, logging temperatures and flow resistance, photographing the field and its outflow channels. He came back the next day and took measurements again, then returned 2 days after that with a hydrologist in tow. Owen, as always, stayed calm. He invited them to access his property officially, unlocked the secondary access gate, and handed over copies of his last pump and inspection report. He didn't editorialize. He didn't complain. He simply provided facts. A week later, a copy of the full report arrived in his mailbox, clean, concise, and damning. Not of Owen, but of Karen. The report concluded that Owen's system was fully operational, well within all thresholds, and had not experienced any structural failure or release. More importantly, it included a final note that secondary surface saturation on the adjacent property was the result of an unpermitted surface graywater disposal system feeding directly into soil that did not meet drainage criteria, specifically A. Slope below minimum grade elevation for uncontrolled outflow. In simple terms, the runoff was hers, not his, and it was a violation. Owen read the report 3 times before carefully slipping it into a folder and placing it next to the certified letter from his attorney. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to retaliate. All he needed was to make the next step public, but not through yelling or accusation. Instead, he forwarded the report through his lawyer to the same neighborhood committee that had earlier labeled his land a hazard. Within 4 days, the tone shifted. The chair of the committee sent him a cautious, politely worded email acknowledging that the situation appeared to have involved some premature conclusions, and offering to reopen discussions should either party wish to pursue neighborhood mediation. Owen didn't respond. He had no interest in mediation. He wasn't interested in resolution. He was interested in boundaries. Real ones, not just fences and documents, but limits that could be enforced without argument. Karen, of course, responded exactly as expected. She stormed onto her deck the next morning, phone pressed to her ear, pacing in broad, angry arcs and gesturing furiously toward Owen's property, though she never looked directly at him. Later that evening, she posted on a local forum under a thinly veiled alias, warning of vindictive neighbors weaponizing the system and exploiting bureaucratic loopholes to silence single homeowners. The post was deleted within hours, flagged for misinformation, but not before screenshots circulated. Some neighbors began to distance themselves, not from Owen, but from Karen. The collapse of her image was not sudden. It was slow, like erosion, a little credibility lost with each official rebuttal, each technical fact she couldn't contest. Her cabin remained standing, but it no longer glowed with possibility. Now it reeked of failure and mold. The walls warped from the earlier flood. The floor softened beneath the rug she had laid to disguise the damage. The cabin was a monument now, not to her vision but to her refusal to respect limits. For the first time, she went quiet. There were no more muffins, no more texts, no more chirpy greetings across the driveway. She began parking on the opposite end of her property, exiting through the back as if trying to shrink from her own mistake. But Owen wasn't fooled. The quiet didn't mean surrender. It meant recalibration. People like Karen didn't accept losses. They revised them, repackaged them, looked for new fronts to advance. And so he continued to prepare, not with spite, but with resolve. He checked the fencing line weekly. He updated the sensor on his main cleanout cap. He had a full inspection scheduled with a third-party specialist, not because anything was failing, but because systems that are attacked should be reinforced, not assumed safe. And every time he walked his property in the dusk, when the light hit the warped paneling of her guest cabin just right, he felt the same calm certainty settle over him. She had tried to use his land. She had tried to rewrite the shape of his home. But the earth itself had spoken first. It had risen back, not with violence, but with clarity, with consequence, and with permanence. The silence didn't last. For a few days, Owen allowed himself to believe, if not in peace, then at least in the possibility of standoff. Karen hadn't approached him, hadn't posted any more nonsense online, and hadn't summoned another round of inspectors. She kept to herself, and although her property was still dotted with signs of unfinished projects, the warped siding of the guest cabin, the trampled hose coiled like a snake along the slope, the leftover stack of unused paneling now dark with mildew, it almost seemed like the storm had passed. But Owen knew better. He had dealt with enough people in his life to recognize the patterns of retaliation not expressed in words or lawsuits, but in the way someone breathed, watched, waited. Karen hadn't surrendered. She was pausing, reassessing her strategy like a chess player caught mid-blunder. And, sure enough, on the fourth day of this uneasy quiet, the next move revealed itself. It started with noise, faint at first, then persistent. Not construction this time, but traffic, delivery vans, landscaping trucks, a bright blue minivan with a novelty decal on the side that read, "Breathe Well, Wellness Retreats." Then came the furniture, modular seating, folding massage tables, faux wood planter boxes with lavender sprigs tucked into synthetic soil. Within 48 hours, her backyard had been transformed from a construction zone into a curated relaxation space, complete with wind chimes, a solar-powered fountain, and a set of bamboo torches that no sane person would use in a wildfire-prone area. Owen observed everything from a distance, not out of nosiness, but out of necessity. He recognized the signs immediately. This wasn't just a guest cabin anymore. Karen had shifted into something more ambitious, something commercial. She wasn't just violating his property, she was monetizing the violation. The final confirmation came when he overheard a visitor one morning, chatting as they walked across the gravel path between her driveway and the back patio. "I've been following your journey since you posted about the water situation," the voice said cheerily. "So brave to turn adversity into a healing opportunity." Karen laughed. "Yes, the land and we've really had to work through some trauma together, but it's healing energy now. It's a space that knows what it's like to be disrespected, and how to rise anyway." Owen closed his back door quietly and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the wall. Healing energy. She had turned trespass into metaphor. She had turned his soil into a spiritual battleground and repainted herself as the survivor. And the worst part was, it might work, because truth was complicated, but stories were simple. And Karen was very good at telling stories. The next wave came quickly. She listed the cabin on a short-term rental platform under the name The Grounded Grove. The photos were carefully staged, soft lighting, fresh linen, close crops that hid the water damage, clever angles that excluded the septic risers just feet away from the entrance. The description was a masterpiece of evasive language. Eco-inspired micro-living cabin surrounded by forested tranquility. Ideal for solo retreats, creative recharge, and emotional detox. Fully off-grid systems reflect the land's commitment to sustainability. Nowhere did it mention the unauthorized plumbing, the unlicensed electrical work, or the active code violations that still lingered in the county file. It didn't need to. She had rebranded reality itself. And people came. They arrived quietly, in pairs or solo, never staying more than 2 nights. They brought yoga mats, matcha kits, self-published poetry books. They took photos of themselves posing barefoot in front of the cabin, arms spread toward the tree line, hashtags loaded with words like renewal, resistance, rooted. At first, Owen let it happen. Part of him wanted to see how far she'd go, how bold the performance could get before the foundation cracked again. But then the real risk emerged. When the guests started using the makeshift outdoor facilities, someone installed a portable chemical toilet unit just off the gravel path, hidden behind a screen of repurposed barnwood. Others simply used the hose shower that still drained directly into the earth. And then, inevitably, the connection was re-established. A new hose, smaller in diameter but more discreetly buried, ran from beneath the cabin and, once again, connected to his clean-out pipe, this time with a pressure-fitted rubber seal that was designed to avoid notice. Owen found it by accident, checking the soil for compaction near his system's edge. One tug, and the thin black pipe popped from beneath a layer of mulch, running like a nerve back toward her structure. This time, he didn't wait. He took photos, marked GPS coordinates, and called his attorney. Dana responded within 20 minutes, voice low and steady. "She's crossed into criminal liability," she said. "This is no longer just civil. Unauthorized access to private infrastructure, particularly involving waste systems, is a health code violation with teeth. We'll file both an injunction and a formal complaint with the County Health Enforcement Division. But you need to prepare. She's going to play this as persecution, and she's going to do it loudly." Owen understood. He had expected it. The next day, while he was at the store buying materials to reinforce his clean-out risers, his driveway was partially blocked by a small group of people holding cardboard signs. Not locals, none of the faces were familiar, but clearly connected to Karen's online world. The signs were vague and spiritual. "Let the land heal. No more ownership, only stewardship. Boundaries are fear." He didn't engage. He pulled slowly into his property, parked, and waited until they drifted away. That evening, he found a note taped to his gate. "You can't own nature." He tore it down without reading the rest, but the legal response moved faster than the rhetoric. Within 5 days, the health department arrived with a cease and desist order taped to Karen's cabin door. The document listed multiple infractions, including unauthorized waste disposal, unpermitted structure usage, and contamination risk due to proximity to active systems. Karen responded with a live stream. Wearing a flowing shawl and standing barefoot on her deck, she addressed her followers with tears in her eyes. "They're trying to silence me," she said, voice trembling. "They're trying to erase the healing I've built. Just because I don't believe in their rigid systems. Just because I believe the land belongs to all of us." Comments poured in, some supportive, some skeptical, but all of them feeding the story. And Owen knew then that truth wouldn't matter to these people. Only narrative. That weekend, he installed motion sensors around the perimeter of his septic field. Not for surveillance, but for documentation. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. He was afraid of erasure. That everything he'd built, everything he'd maintained and preserved, would be rewritten by someone who believed performance was more powerful than permanence. That night, someone tampered with the sensor, not fully disabled, but redirected, pointing toward the tree line instead of the slope. It was subtle, almost professional. When he adjusted it the next morning, he found a feather tucked behind the pole, wrapped in twine and soaked in some kind of oil. It was meant to be symbolic. But to Owen, it was just another layer of intrusion. Dana moved swiftly. The injunction was approved. Karen was legally barred from using the cabin for any occupancy or promotional use. She contested, of course, filed a response citing emotional harm, loss of income, and spiritual trauma. The judge, unmoved, scheduled a hearing and issued a compliance deadline. Owen didn't attend the hearing. He didn't need to. His presence would only feed her martyrdom. But he did receive the final report. Karen had been ordered to disconnect all unauthorized plumbing, cease all commercial promotion, and submit to an environmental inspection. Her appeal was denied. The cabin, once a symbol of expansion, was now a liability that couldn't even be entered without triggering fines. But the escalation wasn't over. 2 nights after the order, Owen woke to the sound of metal scraping. He went out with a flashlight and found the hose removed, clean-out cap slightly ajar, and a bundle of sage smoldering at the base of his pressure riser. A ritual, a protest, a message. He sealed the system again, locked the riser with a new cap, and filed a report with the sheriff. Not because he feared her, but because the paper trail had to remain unbroken. And for the first time, he felt something close to fatigue, not of the body, but of the mind. A kind of erosion, not from any single act, but from the relentlessness of one person's refusal to honor boundary, consequence, or fact. But even fatigue, he reminded himself, was data. Proof that he'd been the one holding the line while she twisted herself into ever more abstract contortions of truth. And in the stillness of that night, standing beside the faint smell of burned sage and the faint echo of someone else's story crashing against the walls of reality, Owen understood that this was no longer about plumbing, or legality, or land. It was about ownership of the narrative, and he wasn't giving it up. By the time the county issued its final compliance directive, Karen had ceased pretending that the cabin was anything other than a failed attempt to establish control. Gone were the flower garlands, the relaxation music, the curated Instagram posts about resilient living. In their place was a quiet, simmering defiance that no longer sought validation but simply refused to admit defeat. The structure itself had become a husk, its windows shuttered, the once white siding stained with moisture and shaded mildew. Even the wind chimes had stopped ringing, tangled in their own strings. Owen would have felt pity if he hadn't spent months watching this woman twist law, language, and logic into weapons. But pity was not a currency he dealt in. He dealt in consequence. And consequence had finally arrived. Not as a dramatic collapse, but as an administrative verdict, written plainly in courier font on stamped paper. Full dismantlement of the unauthorized structure within 30 days, or face escalating daily fines. Line placement and potential forced removal under public sanitation enforcement. There were no more appeals, no more hearings. The decision was final. Karen, however, reacted not with compliance but with her final act of theatrical resistance. On the 3rd day after the order, she erected a series of signs along the edge of her property, just feet from Owen's fence. Painted in uneven red strokes, they bore phrases like, "Land belongs to all," "Systems rot," and "You can't seal spirit." Behind them, she propped a collapsible table with a half-melted candle and a cracked ceramic bowl filled with some foul-smelling herbal mixture. This wasn't protest, it was performance, but performance that carried within it the threat of unpredictability. And unpredictability, to Owen, was more dangerous than any legal threat. The county's enforcement team arrived without ceremony on a foggy Wednesday morning. They came with a flatbed truck, 3 workers in uniform, and a portable waste disposal unit. Karen stood on her porch as they approached, arms crossed, jaws set, refusing to speak or move. One of the workers handed her a copy of the final order. She didn't touch it. Another moved toward the cabin, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of every visible angle. Then, without hesitation, they began. It wasn't violent or rushed. It was clinical, mechanical. Panels were unscrewed, fixtures disconnected. The interior stripped with a practiced efficiency that came not from anger, but from routine. It was a job, not a fight, and that's what made it so effective. Karen's resistance relied on spectacle, but these men didn't argue. They just dismantled. Owen watched from inside, not gloating, not even pleased. There was no pleasure in watching someone unravel, even someone who had done so much to provoke it. But there was clarity, and in that clarity was relief. The structure came down over the course of 2 days. By the second afternoon, all that remained was a rectangle of disturbed soil and a shallow depression where the frame had sunk unevenly into the slope. The foul scent that had once emanated from the flooded foundation was gone, replaced by the clean tang of wet earth and fresh air. Nature, indifferent and patient, was already reclaiming what had been taken from it. But Karen wasn't finished. 3 nights after the dismantling, Owen was woken by the sharp staccato of movement outside. Not loud, but deliberate. He dressed quietly and stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, scanning the yard. There, at the far edge of the property, just beyond the fence line, stood Karen. She wasn't holding signs or burning herbs. She was digging. A shallow trench, maybe a foot deep, cut across the line where her garden used to end. In her hand was a small camping spade, and beside her stood a plastic bin with unmarked contents. When the light from his porch hit her, she didn't flinch. She looked up, eyes flat and unblinking, and said, almost conversationally, "You can't erase me." Owen said nothing. He didn't raise his voice or threaten her. He turned, walked back inside, and made a call. By the time the deputies arrived, she was gone. But the trench remained, along with the bin, still partially buried. Inside it, officers found a mix of compost, scorched earth, and shredded paper soaked in oil. Nothing overtly illegal, but clearly meant to leave a message, one that danced at the edge of threat without crossing the legal line. Psychological warfare dressed in ceremony. The sheriff issued a no trespass warning the next day, formal and enforceable. Karen was barred from stepping within 10 feet of the property line, from installing any temporary or permanent structures, and from engaging in any acts deemed coercive, symbolic, or aggressive. She received the order without argument, but her silence had acquired a weight that made it far more unnerving than her previous theatrics. No more live streams, no more guests, just the quiet hum of someone who had been cornered not by violence or confrontation but by documentation, patience, and unwavering consequence. But the final blow didn't come from the county or the courts. It came from the land itself. A week later, heavy rains returned. The ground, still destabilized from months of poor drainage and unregulated use, shifted. The trench Karen had dug reopened, this time widened by runoff. It carved through the edge of her yard, undercutting the remains of her ornamental fencing and flooding what was left of her makeshift garden. The runoff, uncontrolled and redirected, pooled against the slope above Owen's property, but this time his system held. He had anticipated this, installing reinforced contour barriers and regraded swales months before. While her yard turned into a sodden mess, his remained dry, intact, prepared. Karen stood in the mud that morning, water up to her ankles, face pale with disbelief. She didn't look toward Owen's house. She looked down, as if the earth itself had betrayed her. But it hadn't. The earth had simply remembered what belonged where. Owen didn't approach her. He didn't offer help. He made his way down to the edge of his own slope, inspected the barriers, checked the drainage caps, and, satisfied, returned to his house. The system worked. Not just the pipes and the valves and the soil, but the system of patience, of response instead of reaction, of holding firm against manipulation. The following week, Karen's property was listed for sale. The notice was discreet, no public announcement, no signs posted. But Owen saw the listing online. Charming, forest-adjacent lot with potential for creative redevelopment. Serene setting, perfect for visionary buyers. No mention of the lawsuits, the failed structure, the warnings from the health department. Just another reinvention. Another story ready to be told to someone else. But Owen wouldn't be part of that story. His boundaries had held. His land had spoken. And now, finally, there was nothing left to say. The sign went up on a Tuesday, white, staked neatly into the edge of Karen's property, facing the road. It didn't say, "For sale," in bold red letters like most signs around here. Instead, it bore the sterile branding of a private firm. By appointment only. Contact agent for access. Subdued. Almost embarrassed. As if the land itself no longer wanted attention. Owen saw it on his walk to the mailbox, and for a moment he simply stood still, letting the reality settle like dust. It was over. Not with drama, not with confrontation, not even with apology, just a silent departure. The final move of someone who had exhausted every tactic and found herself nowhere but back at the start, without control, without leverage, without a narrative that anyone else believed. Karen didn't come to say goodbye. She didn't leave a note or send one last passive-aggressive message or even try to reframe her exit as triumph. She simply disappeared. One morning, her car was there, and the next, it was gone. The shades were drawn, the porch furniture vanished, and the house stood hollow. A hollow woman had left a hollow structure behind, and for the first time since she'd moved in, Owen looked across the property line and saw not threat, not manipulation, but vacancy. Unfilled, not just by people, but by energy. And stillness, a different kind of silence than before. This time it wasn't loaded with threat or calculation. It was clean. The following week, a man in a collared shirt and work boots knocked on Owen's door. He introduced himself as part of a surveying crew hired by the agency handling Karen's listing. "They want to make sure the boundary reports are clean," he said apologetically. "We saw your name on the complaint filings. Figured we should check with you." Owen nodded, led him to the stake markers, and handed over copies of every survey and geotechnical report in his file. The man whistled low. "Looks like you've done half our job already," he said. "They don't usually go this deep on residential plots." "They usually don't build over a septic field and try to run a wellness retreat out of it either," Owen replied, not smiling. The man didn't laugh. He just nodded, serious. "We've seen stranger," he said, "but not often." The property lingered on the market longer than expected. There were visits, cautious ones. Real estate agents walking the slope carefully, pointing out areas that might be reclaimed or re-envisioned. No one stayed long. Something about the land repelled them. Or perhaps it was just memory. Stories have a way of clinging to soil, and even the most strategic lighting in a brochure couldn't erase the scent of buried conflict. Owen didn't follow the sale. He didn't care who came next, so long as they respected the line. But part of him knew that whoever it was, they wouldn't come with Karen's energy. That kind of aggression doesn't repeat easily. It burns out, or burns everything. And this time, the land had resisted. One morning, about a month later, Owen stood beside the field and looked out over the tree line, the same view that Karen had once admired before claiming it for her own. He noted the slow return of balance, new grass threading through the scarred soil, drainage settling into predictable rhythms again. The quiet hum of healthy soil. No gurgles, no backflow, just function. It reminded him of his early days in the industry, when systems behaved like ecosystems, not plumbing. You didn't control them, you worked with them, and if you respected their limits, they never failed you. He crouched beside the clean-out cap, ran his fingers over the seal, and tightened the bolt with the wrench he always carried. Not because it needed tightening, but because routine mattered. The rituals you uphold when no one's watching define the stability you get when everything is being watched. He stood, wiped his hands on a cloth, and walked back to the porch, where his coffee waited warm in the thermos. A small thing, but his. Unshared. Undisturbed. Later that day, he received an envelope from the county office. Inside was a short letter confirming that the unauthorized structure had been removed in full, that all imposed fines had been paid through escrow, and that no further complaints or legal activity were pending on either parcel. A bureaucratic formality, perhaps, but to Owen it was a closing bracket. The sentence had ended. He slid the letter into a folder in his cabinet, right between the photo of the illegal connector and the time-stamped footage of the flood backflow. He didn't need them anymore, but he kept them, not for revenge or record, but for truth, for the knowledge that when